The smell hit Dante Rivero before his eyes adjusted to the basement's darkness, mildew, and something else. Something organic and wrong that made his instincts scream danger before his mind could process why. He'd acquired the property 3 days ago through a shell company, a foreclosure auction where nobody asked questions about the cash buyer who never showed his face. The multi-story building in Baltimore's industrial district had 4 floors above ground and a documented basement level. But according to blueprints, there shouldn't be a sub-basement beneath that. The structure was supposed to be empty, gutted by the previous owner's bankruptcy and years of neglect. But empty buildings didn't consume electricity, and Dante's people had flagged an anomaly in the power usage that didn't match the property records. Now he stood in the hidden lower level, his Salvatore Ferragamo Oxfords gathering dust that looked more like ash in the beam of his flashlight. The contractor beside him, a man named Yev, who'd renovated half of Dante's legitimate properties without ever asking about the illegitimate ones, had stopped talking mid-sentence when they'd found the concealed door. It wasn't on any blueprint. Not on the original 1,920 seconds construction documents. Not on the 1,970 seconds renovation permits. Not on the 2015 inspection reports that had cleared the building for commercial use. Someone had built this addition off the books, which meant someone had something to hide. The door itself was industrial grade, the kind used in commercial freezers or pharmaceutical storage. A keypad lock glowed faint red in the darkness, still drawing power from a line that snaked up through the ceiling and disappeared into the infrastructure above. Fresh scratches marked the metal around the lock, recent, desperate, made by something harder than fingernails but softer than tools. "Boss," Yev said quietly, his Ukrainian accent thickening the way it always did when he was nervous. "Maybe we call the police? This is not our business to." "No police." Dante's voice cut through the suggestion with the finality of a blade. His organization hadn't survived 3 generations by inviting law enforcement into their business, even when the business was technically legal. "Open it." Yev pulled out his electrical kit, the same tools he used to bypass security systems when discretion required it. His hands shook slightly as he worked, prying off the keypad cover to access the wiring beneath. Dante watched without offering help, his mind already calculating possibilities and running through scenarios. Drug operation, human trafficking way station, illegal weapons cache, money laundering hub. The list of reasons someone would build a hidden room in an abandoned building scrolled through his thoughts with the ease of long experience in cataloging criminal enterprise. The lock clicked. The magnetic seal released with a sound like exhaled breath, and the heavy door swung inward on hinges that barely whispered despite years without maintenance. Someone had kept them oiled, which meant someone had been accessing this room regularly until very recently. The flashlight beam cut through darkness that seemed thicker than normal air, illuminating details that assembled themselves into understanding one piece at a time. A mattress on the floor, thin and stained with substances Dante didn't want to identify. A bucket in the corner that explained part of the smell. A folding table with empty water bottles and protein bar wrappers scattered across its surface. A chain anchored to the wall that ended in an open shackle, the metal crusted with something dark. And on the concrete floor, crumpled as if it had been dropped in haste or thrown in anger, was a jacket Dante would have recognized anywhere in the world, in any condition, under any circumstances. Navy blue. Expensive wool blend. Custom tailored by a shop in Little Italy that had dressed 3 generations of Rivero men. And on the inner label, stitched in thread that matched the family crest, were the initials M.R. Marco Rivero, his brother, who'd been missing for 8 months, 17 days, and approximately 6 hours. Dante had counted every single one of them. Dante's hand closed around the jacket before conscious thought directed the movement. The fabric was cold, slightly damp from the basement's humidity, but unmistakably his brother's. He'd been there when Marco had picked it up from the tailor, had ribbed him about spending $2,000 on a jacket he'd probably ruin within a month. Marco had laughed and said some things were worth the investment, that looking like you belonged in power meant you could actually hold it. The last time Dante had seen his brother alive, Marco had been wearing this jacket. "Boss?" Yev's voice seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the sudden ringing in Dante's ears. "Boss, what is?" A sound cut through the basement's dead air. Small, careful. the whisper of fabric against concrete coming from deeper in the darkness, from a corner the flashlight beam hadn't yet reached, from a space that shouldn't contain anything living. Dante's hand moved to the gun under his jacket with the smooth automation of reflex, the Beretta 92 FS finding his palm like it was magnetized. He swept the light toward the sound with his other hand, and the beam caught something that made his breath stop in his chest, made his heart skip a beat before hammering back to life with painful force. A woman, pressed into the corner where two walls met, her arms wrapped around her knees in a protective posture that spoke of long practice, her dark hair hanging in tangles that obscured most of her face. She wore clothes that had once been nice designer jeans, a cashmere sweater now filthy and torn in places that suggested violence or desperate struggle. Her bare feet were cut and bruised, the soles black with dirt and dried blood. Her visible eye was wide and feral, tracking the gun in his hand with the fixed attention of prey watching a predator decide whether to strike. And around her wrist, raw and bleeding beneath a crust of infection, was the mark of the shackle that now lay empty on the floor beside the chain. She'd freed herself. Recently, maybe when she'd heard them at the door, using whatever she'd finally managed to improvise or discover, after however long she'd been trapped in this tomb. "Please," she whispered, her voice destroyed by screaming or thirst or both, barely recognizable as human speech. "Please, I'll do whatever you want. Just don't." She stopped, her eye finding his face in the backwash of flashlight beam, and her expression shifted from terror to confusion to something that looked almost like recognition, though Dante was certain he'd never seen her before in his life. "You're not him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Dante's mind was already processing and rejecting and reconsidering in rapid succession. Not him, not the person she'd expected, not the person who'd put her here, who'd kept her here, who'd left her here to die or worse, but someone who looked enough like him that she'd recognized a resemblance even in the uncertain light of a flashlight beam. Someone who'd left his brother's jacket on the floor of her prison. Dante lowered the gun slowly, the movement deliberate and visible, the kind of gesture meant to communicate intention across the barrier of terror that separated them. The woman flinched anyway, pressing harder into the corner as if she could phase through concrete and disappear into the building's foundation, escape into the earth itself. "Yev, get water," Dante said without turning, his eyes never leaving the woman's face, afraid that if he looked away she might vanish like an apparition, like something his guilt-ridden mind had conjured. "And a blanket from the car. First aid kit. Now." The contractor didn't argue or ask questions. His footsteps retreated quickly across the concrete, grateful for permission to leave whatever nightmare he'd stumbled into, to return to a world where basements contained only forgotten furniture and boxes of old tax returns. Dante holstered the weapon with careful precision and raised both hands, palms forward, fingers spread a universal signal of non-aggression that felt absurd given everything about this situation, given who he was and what he represented in Baltimore's underworld. "I'm not going to hurt you. The door's open. You can leave whenever you want. I'll help you leave right now if that's what you want." She laughed, a sound so broken it barely qualified as human, more like something dying than something living. That's what he said. At first, before, she stopped, her visible eye squeezing shut against memories that played behind her eyelids. How long? The question was asked to herself more than to him, a desperate calculation that suggested she'd lost track of time in the darkness, that days and nights had blurred together when the only light came from whatever minimal illumination her captor had provided, when there were no windows to mark the sun's passage, no sounds of traffic to distinguish morning from evening. "Today is March 14th, Dante said, keeping his voice level and quiet, the tone he used for spooked animals and traumatized children. "Thursday, early morning, about 2 a.m. Can you tell me your name?" She opened her eye again, studying him with an intensity that suggested her mind was still working despite her body's obvious trauma, that whatever had been done to her physically hadn't broken the sharp intelligence that looked out from behind her gaze. "Why do you have his jacket?" Not an answer to his question, but a counter-question that revealed what had captured her attention, what had sparked that moment of recognition. Dante looked down at Marco's jacket, still clutched in his left hand, the fabric bunched between his fingers, the monogrammed label visible where the collar had folded. "It's my brother's. He's been missing since July. I've been looking for him for 8 months, spending every resource I have, calling in every favor, checking every lead, no matter how thin." The woman's expression shifted, cycling through emotions too quickly to identify individually surprise, confusion, calculation, and something that might have been grief or might have been relief, or might have been some combination of both that didn't have a name. "Marco," she whispered, and the name came out like a prayer or a curse or possibly both. He said his name was Marco. The confirmation hit Dante like physical impact, like a fist to the solar plexus that drove the air from his lungs. His brother had been here, in this room, with this woman. The questions multiplied exponentially in his mind. Was Marco the captor? Was he another victim? Had he escaped? Was he dead? And if he was the one who'd imprisoned her, what did that make Dante, who shared his blood, his face, his name? "When did you last see him?" Dante asked, and he was aware that his voice had changed, that the careful neutrality had fractured under the weight of desperate need to know, to understand what had happened to the brother he'd loved since they were children playing in the streets of Little Italy. "I don't, time doesn't." She pressed her palms against her temples, fingers digging into her scalp. "There was a window at first. Before he moved me here, I could count days by the light. 7, maybe 8 months. He brought me here after I tried to escape the first time. Said the new place was more secure, that nobody would find it, and that I needed to understand he was doing this for my own good. 8 months. The same timeline as Marco's disappearance. The same jacket. The same first name. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture Dante didn't want to see, into an understanding that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family, his brother, himself. "Did he hurt you?" Dante heard himself ask, even though the evidence was written on her body in bruises and cuts and the raw wounds around her wrist. Even though the question was stupid and obvious and insulting in its inadequacy, "He tried to be careful," she said, and the words were somehow more damning than if she'd described violence in explicit detail. Like he was following rules, like there was a right way to keep someone prisoner, a humane way to destroy someone's life. Her voice dropped to barely audible, forcing Dante to lean forward slightly to hear. "He talked to me like we were dating, brought nice food sometimes, asked about my day as if I'd been anywhere except chained to this wall, as if I had stories to tell about anything other than counting ceiling cracks and planning escapes that never worked." The description matched nothing Dante knew about his brother. Marco had been impulsive, yes. Reckless in his personal life, absolutely. Quick to anger and sometimes violent when drunk or provoked. But this level of sustained cruelty, this calculated imprisonment, this systematic dehumanization, it suggested pathology that left no room for the man Dante had known since birth, the brother who'd taught him to ride a bike and covered for him when he stayed out past curfew and stood beside him at their father's funeral. "What's your name?" he asked again, needing something to anchor this nightmare to reality, to transform this broken woman into a person with an identity beyond victim. She hesitated, as if her identity was the last piece of herself she still controlled, the final thing her captor hadn't been able to take from her. Sarah Hallen. The name hit Dante's memory like a key turning in a lock, releasing a flood of recognition. Sarah Hallen. Missing person report filed 9 months ago in Washington, D.C. Art gallery curator. Last seen leaving work on a Tuesday evening in June. Case gone cold within weeks when no leads materialized, no witnesses came forward, no body was discovered. He'd seen her face on the news at some point. Another tragedy in a world full of them. Another young woman vanished into the void that swallowed people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Until now. Until his missing brother's jacket connected everything in ways that made Dante's careful understanding of his family begin to crack and crumble. "Sarah," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue, making it real. "I'm Dante, Marco's older brother, and I need you to tell me everything you can remember, everything that happened, because I think finding you might be the key to finding him." Yev returned with supplies, water bottles, a blanket, and without being asked, a first aid kit from the contractor's perpetually well-stocked truck. He set everything just inside the doorway and retreated again, reading Dante's body language correctly enough to know he wasn't wanted for this conversation, that whatever was happening here required privacy and discretion. Dante approached slowly, each step measured and announced, stopping several feet away from where Sarah remained pressed against the wall. He set the water within her reach, then stepped back to give her space, to let her make the choice to take it rather than having anything forced upon her. She watched him with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned that kindness could be prelude to violence, that gifts came with strings attached, but thirst eventually overrode caution. Her hands shook as she opened the bottle, and she drank too fast, her body's desperate need overwhelming the rationality that would tell her to go slower. That gulping water after prolonged dehydration could make her sick. "Easy," Dante said quietly, using the same gentle tone. "You'll make yourself sick. Small sips. We have plenty more." She stopped, lowered the bottle, and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The simple gesture somehow made her seem more real, less like an apparition conjured from his worst nightmares about what might have happened to Marco, about what darkness might have been lurking beneath his brother's surface all along. "How did you find this place?" Her voice was stronger now, hydration already making a difference in her ability to speak clearly. "Bought the building 3 days ago. Noticed power usage that shouldn't exist in an abandoned property. Investigated." The facts were simple, but they felt inadequate to explain the cosmic coincidence that had led him to this specific property in a city of thousands of potential real estate investments, that had brought him here on this particular night at this particular hour. "I didn't know you were here. Didn't know Marco had been here. I was just following an anomaly in the electrical bills. Lucky for me." The words carried no gratitude, just exhausted observation of a universe that had finally thrown her a rope after months of drowning. Dante thought about the timing if he'd bought a different property that week, if he'd delegated the inspection to someone else, if he'd ignored the electrical anomaly as a simple billing error or faulty meter. How long would she have remained locked in this room? Days? Weeks? Until dehydration or starvation or infection made the question irrelevant? Until she became another cold case file gathering dust in a police station basement? "Can you walk?" he asked, already planning the logistics of getting her out, of finding medical care without attracting attention that would bring questions he couldn't answer. Sarah looked down at her damaged feet as if noticing them for the first time, as if the pain had become so constant she'd learned to ignore it. "I don't know. I haven't tried to stand in." She stopped, doing the math she'd been avoiding, calculating the days or weeks since she'd last been allowed to leave the corner that had become her entire world. "A while. A long while. There's a hospital 10 minutes away. I can—" "No hospitals." Her response was immediate and sharp, carrying a fear that overrode even her obvious need for medical attention. He said if I went to a hospital, he'd know, that he had people watching, that I should be grateful he was taking care of me, because if his family found out what he'd done, they'd finish what he started. They'd kill me to protect their secrets. The words landed in Dante's chest like shrapnel, each one a small wound that accumulated into something larger and more painful. His family. Marco had told her that the Riveros would kill her if they discovered her existence, which meant Marco had known that what he was doing was unforgivable even by their organization's flexible moral standards, that it crossed lines even criminals recognized. Or it meant Dante's mind supplied the alternative before he could stop it, before he could prevent the thought from forming. It meant Marco had been trying to protect her from someone else, that he'd hidden her badly, but hidden her nonetheless, that the imprisonment was protective custody gone catastrophically wrong, that his brother had been trying to save her from some greater threat and had lost himself in the process. But the evidence in this room suggested control, not protection. The chain, the hidden location, the months of captivity. These weren't the actions of someone trying to keep someone safe. These were the actions of someone who decided another person was property, was a thing to be kept and controlled and used. Unless, the thought crystallized slowly, assembling itself from fragments of memory and observation, from pieces of his own history that Dante had spent decades trying to forget. He thought about his own childhood, about the 6 months when he was 14 that he'd spent in what his father had called secure education, a facility upstate where boys who'd witnessed things they shouldn't have were kept comfortable but confined until the danger passed or until they'd been properly educated in the family business, until they understood that loyalty meant silence, even when silence felt like suffocation. He'd been locked in a room smaller than this one, fed well but not permitted to leave, told it was for his protection after he'd accidentally witnessed a business transaction that had ended in bodies that needed disposal. His father had explained that bad men would come looking for witnesses, that Dante was safer hidden than exposed, that the locks were to keep danger out, not to keep him in, that this was what love looked like in their world, protection disguised as imprisonment. He'd believed it for 3 months before realizing the real threat wasn't outside the locked door. The real threat was the man who claimed to be protecting him while teaching him that confinement and care could coexist, that loving someone meant controlling them completely. Dante looked at Sarah at her raw wrists, her damaged feet, and her eyes that had learned to calculate danger in the shape of every shadow, and saw himself at 14. He saw every person his family had ever protected through confinement, every child taught that love and imprisonment could coexist, every victim told that their suffering was necessary for a greater purpose they couldn't understand but should trust. "Marco's not coming back," Dante said, and the words carried certainty he couldn't fully explain, an instinct that came from knowing his brother in ways that went deeper than blood. "Whatever he did, whatever he told you, it ends now, right now. You're free." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie or the catch or the hidden cost of liberation, looking for the trap that would spring shut once she allowed herself to believe. "Why should I believe you?" "Because," Dante said quietly, meeting her gaze with unflinching honesty, "I know exactly what it feels like to be locked in a room by someone who says they love you. I know what it's like to be told that captivity is care. And I swore when I got out that I'd never do that to anyone else, that I'd never become the man my father tried to make me." The truth settled between them like a weight neither had expected to carry together, creating a bridge across the gulf that separated captor's brother from victim, connecting two people who understood something about darkness that most people never had to learn. 3 hours later, Dante's penthouse office overlooked Baltimore's inner harbor, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view that had cost him $7 million and countless compromises with his conscience. The city lights reflected off black water like scattered diamonds, beautiful and indifferent to the human suffering that happened in the spaces between their glow, in the basements and back rooms where nightmares unfolded while the world slept. Sarah sat in the leather armchair across from his desk, showered and dressed in clothes his housekeeper had purchased during an emergency midnight shopping trip to an all-night department store. The cashmere sweater and tailored pants fit well enough, but she wore them like armor, her posture rigid with the awareness that comfort could be revoked without warning, that safety was a temporary illusion that could shatter at any moment. She'd refused the hospital but accepted his private physician, a man named Dr. Okafor, who'd treated enough of Dante's people to know that questions endangered everyone, that discretion was more valuable than curiosity. The doctor had cleaned and bandaged her feet, treated the infected wounds on her wrists with antibiotics and careful stitching, administered IV fluids for dehydration, checked her for broken bones and internal injuries, and prescribed medications without once asking how she'd sustained injuries consistent with prolonged captivity. He'd left with a look that told Dante they'd be having a conversation later, but that conversation could wait until the immediate crisis was managed. Now Sarah held a mug of tea that had gone cold while Dante's people assembled information on the screens that covered one wall of his office. Faces, documents, property records, financial transactions, the digital architecture of his brother's last 8 months, materializing in real time, as his organization stripped away the layers of obfuscation Marco had constructed around his double life. The building was purchased through a shell corporation 14 months ago, Vincent Calabrese reported, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone delivering bad news to dangerous people while trying to maintain professional distance. Dante's head of security had worked for the Rivero family since before Dante was born, had taught both brothers how to shoot when they were barely tall enough to hold the guns steady, had been more father figure than their actual father in many ways. Now he stood with his tablet glowing in the dark office, navigating through evidence that painted his favorite student as a monster. Initial LLC filing lists Marco as the registered agent. He used a lawyer in Delaware, paid cash for everything, and covered his tracks well. professional-level operational security. Dante felt Sarah's eyes on him, watching for his reaction, measuring whether he'd protect his brother's reputation or prioritize her justice. He kept his expression neutral through decades of practice in controlling what his face revealed, in negotiating while giving nothing away. What else? Bank records show regular cash withdrawals from his personal accounts, always under $10,000 to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements. Started about 10 months ago, stopped 7 months ago when his accounts went dormant, and the withdrawals ceased completely. Vincent swiped to the next screen, showing a spreadsheet that tracked his brother's financial dissolution with accountant's precision. The amounts matched typical expenses for maintaining someone long-term: food, supplies, utilities for a second location, medical supplies, everything you'd need for extended captivity. "He was planning it," Sarah said quietly, her first words since they'd arrived at the penthouse an hour ago. "Before he took me. The place he kept me initially, the apartment, it was already set up, reinforced locks, soundproofing panels on the walls, a bedroom that locked from the outside. He didn't improvise any of this. He knew exactly what he was doing." The confirmation made something twist in Dante's chest, a pain that felt almost physical. Premeditation suggested calculation rather than impulse, meant Marco had spent months preparing to kidnap someone, building the infrastructure of imprisonment before selecting his victim, before choosing Sarah specifically from whatever pool of potential targets he'd been evaluating. The brother Dante had known reckless, passionate, occasionally violent but never systematic about it, wouldn't have had the patience for this level of planning, for this degree of methodical preparation. "Show me the apartment," Dante instructed, needing to see the full scope of what his brother had constructed. Vincent pulled up property records for an address in Fells Point, a gentrifying neighborhood where young professionals paid premium rent for exposed brick and harbor views, where nobody asked too many questions about their neighbor's business. Leased under another LLC, same lawyer, same cash payment structure. Marco never officially lived there according to any records, but neighbors reported seeing a man matching his description coming and going irregularly, usually late at night or early morning. "Did anyone report seeing me?" Sarah asked, leaning forward despite obvious pain from her damaged feet, despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of her body. "Anyone call the police about suspicious activity? About hearing anything?" Vincent's expression answered before his words did, his face showing the resignation of someone who'd seen this pattern too many times before. No reports filed, no calls to authorities, no concerned neighbors wondering about the woman who never left the building, who never appeared at windows, whose existence never registered on anyone's consciousness. Sarah laughed. That same broken sound from the basement, like something inside her that understood dark humor had survived when everything else had been stripped away. "Of course not. He was careful about that too. Said if I screamed, nobody would care. That people in cities had learned to ignore sounds that inconvenienced them, that urban life required selective deafness and strategic blindness. He was right." Dante thought about his own building, about how many times he'd heard arguments through walls, sounds that might have been violence or might have been rough intimacy, or might have been television dramas played too loud. He'd never investigated, never called anyone, never asked questions that might require uncomfortable answers. The shame of that complicity settled over him like a weight, like an accusation he couldn't deflect because it was entirely accurate. "Why you?" he asked. The question that had been circling his mind since learning her name, since understanding that she wasn't random but chosen, selected for reasons that mattered to Marco's broken psychology. How did Marco choose you specifically? What was the connection? Sarah set down her cold tea with deliberate care, the mug clicking against the glass side table with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet office. "I thought you'd already know. Thought that's why you found me, why you were looking for this specific property. I know you were reported missing 9 months ago in DC. Art gallery curator. No family locally. Single. Living alone." Dante had read the missing person report during the car ride from the building to his penthouse, had memorized the sparse details of her life before Marco had stolen it, had noted the things that had made her vulnerable to predation. But that doesn't explain the connection, the reason he fixated on you rather than someone else. The gallery hosted an exhibition of Italian modern art last year. Your family's foundation was one of the sponsors. She watched his face carefully, looking for recognition, for understanding of how their worlds had intersected months before the kidnapping. Marco attended the opening reception. We talked about a Mirandi's still life. He seemed knowledgeable, charming, and completely normal. Asked if he could take me to dinner to continue the conversation about art. The foundation. Dante's legitimate business interests, the charitable face the family showed to Baltimore society, the mask of respectability worn over criminal enterprise. They sponsored art exhibitions, youth programs, community development projects, everything designed to transform criminal profits into social capital, to buy goodwill and access and the appearance of civic virtue. Marco had been the public face of those efforts, glad-handing donors and cutting ribbons and giving speeches, while Dante managed the actual business that funded everything. "You dated him?" Dante said. Not a question, but a statement that required confirmation. 3 months. Dinners, gallery events, weekends in Annapolis, sailing on his boat. He never mentioned having a brother, never talked about his family beyond vague references to business interests that he kept separate from his personal life. I thought he was just private, maybe a little compartmentalized, but nothing that raised red flags. Her hands twisted together in her lap, fingers intertwining and separating in nervous patterns. The night he took me, we'd had an argument. I'd found texts on his phone from other women, confronted him about lying, about the secret relationships he was maintaining. He said he could explain everything, asked me to come to his apartment to talk privately where we wouldn't be interrupted. And when you got there, the door locked behind me. Different kind of lock than normal deadbolts. Something industrial that clicked shut automatically. He'd been crying. Said he was sorry, that he didn't want to do this. But I'd left him no choice by pushing too hard and asking too many questions. That if I really loved him, I'd understand he was protecting me from myself, from the choices that would destroy me. Her voice dropped to barely audible. He said this was the only way to keep me safe. Vincent cleared his throat, drawing Dante's attention back to the screens where more information had populated during Sierra's recounting. There's more, boss. Marco's phone records from the months before he disappeared. The pattern is unusual. The call logs filled the display, hundreds of outgoing calls to numbers Vincent had already traced through contacts and reverse lookups. Dante scanned the names and felt his understanding of reality continue to fracture, to reorganize itself around new information that contradicted everything he thought he knew. Dr. Brennan, a psychiatrist who specialized in personality disorders and obsessive behaviors, called 17 times over 3 months, sessions that lasted 45 to 60 minutes each. Attorney Wallace, a criminal defense lawyer who'd never represented the family, who specialized in domestic violence and kidnapping cases, called 9 times for consultations that suggested Marco was seeking legal advice about his own potential crimes. Father DiMatteo, a priest at a church Marco had never attended, someone who ran support groups for people struggling with impulse control, called 6 times, the last conversation lasting nearly 2 hours. And one number called more than all the others combined, a contact listed only as sponsor in Marco's phone. 83 calls over 4 months, each lasting between 20 and 58 minutes, the pattern consistent with someone checking in regularly with an accountability partner. The sponsor number belongs to a Harold Keating, Vincent said, pulling up a driver's license photo of a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a tired smile that spoke of someone who'd seen the worst in people and still maintained compassion. Recovered addict who's been sober 23 years. Runs a support group out of street. Agnes church basement for people dealing with obsessive behaviors and impulse control issues. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture Dante hadn't anticipated, into a narrative that complicated the simple monster story he'd been constructing in his mind. Marco seeing a psychiatrist, calling lawyers to understand the legal consequences of his actions, reaching out to clergy for spiritual guidance, talking to a sponsor about addiction or compulsion or whatever demons had driven him to build a prison and fill it with a woman he claimed to love. His brother had been trying to get help, trying to fix himself, trying to resist whatever sickness had taken root in his psychology, and he'd failed and disappeared, leaving Sarah locked in that basement to die alone in the dark. He knew something was wrong with him, Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the hum of electronics and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Toward the end, before he moved me to the basement, he'd sit on the floor outside the locked bedroom and talk through the door. Said he'd tried to get help, tried to fix himself, tried everything he could think of, but nothing worked. That the urge to keep me, to own me completely, was stronger than his ability to resist it. He'd cry and apologize and then lock the door again and leave me there for days. Did he say why he moved you to the building basement? Dante asked, needing to understand the progression, the deterioration from bad to catastrophically worse. Someone was asking questions. Someone in his family was getting suspicious about his behavior, noticing changes in his patterns and habits. He said the apartment wasn't safe anymore, that he needed somewhere more secure until he figured out what to do. Her eyes met Dante's with laser focus. I think he was talking about you. The words landed like a physical blow. Dante remembered the last conversation he'd had with his brother, 2 days before Marco vanished from the face of the earth. They'd been in this same office, late-night discussion about expansion opportunities in Philadelphia, about territories and partnerships and the usual business that occupied their days. Marco had seemed distracted, kept checking his phone with increasing agitation, and couldn't focus on the spreadsheets and projections that normally captured his complete attention. When Dante had asked what was wrong, Marco had stood abruptly and said something that hadn't made sense at the time. Words that had seemed like philosophy, major pretension, but now revealed themselves as something darker. Do you think people can change who they are fundamentally? Or are we just playing out predetermined patterns until we die, acting out scripts written in our DNA or our childhood or whatever shapes us? Dante had laughed it off as existential angst, Marco's occasional tendency toward dramatic introspection that came out when he'd been drinking or was stressed about something. Now the question revealed itself as a man recognizing his own pathology and asking whether escape was possible, whether transformation was achievable, or if he was doomed to become the monster he could feel growing inside him. Where is he? Sarah asked, and the question carried hope and dread in equal measure. The possibility that Marco was alive somewhere warring with the terror of what that would mean for her safety. Your brother. If he's been missing as long as I've been imprisoned, then someone else must know something, must have seen something. What happened to Marco? Vincent pulled up the final piece of evidence, the discovery that had taken 3 days of searching property records and cross-referencing utility usage against corporate filings. A storage unit in Essex, climate-controlled and isolated, rented under the same Delaware LLC that owned the building. Power consumption, suggesting temperature control for biological preservation, for keeping something from decomposing in the Maryland heat. Unit 247, Vincent said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of implications he didn't want to speak aloud. Climate-controlled. Rented 9 months ago, shortly after you were reported missing. Never accessed according to facility security logs after initial setup. No one entering or leaving once the unit was established. Dante stood, his legs moving before conscious decision directed them toward the door, toward the parking garage, toward whatever waited in that storage unit. He knew what they'd find before Vincent said the words, before evidence confirmed what instinct had already calculated with terrible certainty. Marco was dead. Had been dead for months. Had died and left Sarah locked in that basement with no one knowing she was there. No one coming to rescue her, no one even looking in the right places because the man who'd imprisoned her had taken his secrets to the grave. Boss, Vincent said, reaching out as if to physically restrain him. We need to be smart about this. If Marco's in there, we need to control the narrative before anyone else finds out, before this becomes public in ways we can't manage. The organization, the family reputation, your mother. Get Yev's crew, Dante interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of command that ended discussion and compelled obedience. The ones who do demolition cleanup, who know how to handle sensitive situations. Tell them we need a discreet retrieval and complete sanitization of a scene. No police involvement, no official records, no paper trail that connects any of this back to us. You're going to cover it up? Sarah's voice cut through the room with unexpected steel, with the kind of strength that surprised Dante given everything she'd endured. She stood on damaged feet that should have kept her sitting, stood despite pain and exhaustion and the trauma that would have broken most people completely. Your brother kidnapped and imprisoned me for 8 months, tortured me physically and psychologically, left me there to die alone, and you're going to make it all disappear to protect your family's reputation?" Dante turned to face her. This woman who'd survived his brother's obsession and emerged with enough strength to challenge a mafia don in his own office, to demand accountability, when she should have been grateful just to be alive. "I'm going to find out what happened. Then I'm going to decide what justice looks like. But I won't let my brother's crimes destroy what's left of my family's name before I understand the full picture, before I know everything that led to this moment." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, a reflexive defense of family honor that crumbled under the weight of what Marco had done, under the undeniable evidence of crimes that deserved exposure and punishment, rather than protection and concealment. But generations of Rivero blood demanded loyalty first and truth second, and Dante couldn't turn off that programming even when every moral instinct screamed that it was wrong, that protecting the guilty made him complicit in their crimes. Sarah's eyes blazed with fury that transcended fear. "Then I'm coming with you. I deserve to know how this ends. I've earned that right by surviving what your brother did to me." The storage facility sprawled across 5 acres of industrial wasteland in Essex, the kind of place people kept belongings they couldn't bear to discard but couldn't stand to see, where the detritus of broken relationships and failed businesses gathered dust behind numbered doors. Dante's convoy arrived at 3 a.m. when the security guard was deep into his overnight shift routine, drowsy from coffee and boredom, and the endless monotony of watching empty aisles. Vincent had already handled the complicated part, a phone call to the facility's owner, a man who'd borrowed money from Rivero interests 3 years ago and still carried that debt like a shadow he couldn't escape. One conversation was all it took. The security cameras would malfunction for exactly 90 minutes. The guard would take an early break at an opportune moment. The gate code would be provided with no questions asked because questions created liability, and liability was more dangerous than ignorance in Baltimore's underworld economy. Sarah sat beside Dante in the back of the Mercedes, her fingers twisted together in her lap with enough force to blanch her knuckles white against tanned skin. She'd insisted on coming despite Dr. Okafor's protests, despite the obvious pain each step caused on her damaged feet, despite the psychological wisdom that suggested shielding victims from confronting their abuser's final moments. "Some things required witnessing to believe," she'd said. "Some endings needed to be seen to be real, to be accepted as truth rather than comforting fiction." Unit 247 sat in the facility's back corner, a 10x10 space with a rolling metal door and a combination lock that Vincent's equipment cracked in under 2 minutes. Electronic bypass tools making short work of security, meant to keep out casual thieves rather than professional criminals. The lock mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the pre-dawn silence, like a gunshot echoing across the empty facility. Yev's crew stood ready with equipment that looked industrial, but served darker purposes: heavy plastic sheeting, chemical cleaners, body bags in 3 sizes, for situations that required discretion more than dignity. They waited at a respectful distance, experienced enough to know that some discoveries required privacy before becoming problems to solve, that certain truths needed to be witnessed by principals before the cleanup could begin. Dante gripped the door handle, cold metal biting into his palm even through the leather gloves he wore. Every instinct screamed at him to send Sarah away, to spare her whatever waited inside this sealed tomb, to shoulder this burden alone rather than forcing her to confront the end of her captor's story. But she'd earned the right to witness this, had paid for it with 8 months of her life stolen and brutalized, had purchased this moment with suffering that couldn't be quantified or compensated but only acknowledged. "Ready?" he asked quietly, giving her one last chance to change her mind, to wait in the car while he handled this alone. She nodded, her jaw set with determination that reminded him uncomfortably of Marco's expression when his brother had decided something was worth the cost. That same stubborn refusal to back down even when wisdom suggested retreat. The door rolled up with a metallic shriek that echoed across the empty facility, the sound bouncing off corrugated steel buildings before dissipating into the night. Interior lights flickered on automatically, fluorescent tubes humming to life and revealing a space that had been converted into something between a shrine and a confession, between a memorial and an apology that could never be adequate. The climate control unit hummed steadily in the corner, maintaining temperature at exactly 58 degrees according to the digital readout on its face. But they didn't need the cold for preservation. That function was handled by the industrial-grade freezer against the back wall, its steady drone providing white noise for the silence of death that filled this space like a physical presence. The rest of the unit was filled with evidence of Marco's unraveling, a timeline of psychological deterioration documented in obsessive detail. The walls were covered in papers, printed articles about obsessive love disorder, compulsive control behaviors, and psychiatric treatment options for personality disorders. Entire sections were dedicated to legal consequences of kidnapping, with passages highlighted in yellow and annotated in Marco's precise handwriting, notes in the margins analyzing sentencing guidelines and precedents that might apply to his case. He was researching himself, Sarah whispered, moving closer to read the wall of documentation despite her obvious fear. Like he was trying to diagnose his own pathology, to understand what was wrong with him well enough to fix it or at least explain it. A desk in the corner held a laptop, still plugged in and charging after months of disuse. Vincent moved toward it with gloved hands, opening the screen to reveal a document titled simply, Confession. The file was 127 pages long, single-spaced text without formatting, dated entries spanning the 8 months of Sarah's captivity and Marco's descent into whatever hell he'd created for himself. Dante scanned the first entry, Marco's words reaching out from whatever afterlife existed or didn't exist, a voice from the grave that still carried the cadence and vocabulary of the brother he'd known. I know what I'm doing is wrong. I can feel it eating me from the inside. This thing that wears my face and uses my hands but isn't really me anymore. I see her locked in that room, and some part of me screams to let her go, to be the man I thought I was before this sickness took root. But a stronger part, the part that's winning every battle, tells me she's safer with me than in a world that would use her and discard her. That my love, twisted and diseased as it is more honest than the performative kindness of men who'd pretend to respect her freedom while systematically eroding it through manipulation and gaslighting. At least my prison has visible walls. Jesus Christ. Vincent breathed, continuing to scroll through months of self-justification and self-loathing documented in meticulous detail, through a confession that tried to be honest while still defending the indefensible. But the laptop and the walls weren't what held Dante's attention with gravitational force. The freezer called to him with magnetic inevitability, its presence demanding acknowledgement the way black holes demanded recognition through the absence of light. He crossed the unit in 3 steps and gripped the handle, the metal so cold it burned against his palm even through the gloves, frost forming on the surface where his body heat met refrigerated steel. Dante, wait. Sarah started, but he was already pulling the door open, already seeing what 8 months of searching had brought him to. What conclusion had been waiting since the moment he'd found Marco's jacket on that basement floor. Marco sat inside, frozen in a position that suggested he'd climbed in while still alive and conscious, making a deliberate choice rather than being placed there after death. His back was against the freezer wall, his legs drawn up to his chest, his arms wrapped around his knees like a child, trying to make himself small, trying to disappear into a space that couldn't contain his guilt. His eyes were closed. His expression was almost peaceful despite the blue-white of frost-covered skin, despite the ice crystals that had formed in his hair and on his eyelashes. A pistol lay on the freezer floor beside him, Marco's 1911 that their father had given him on his 21st birthday, the gun that was supposed to protect him from the family's enemies. Unfired, present but unused, as if Marco had brought it as an option but chosen a slower, colder death instead. And taped to the inside of the freezer door, positioned where Marco would have seen it before closing himself inside, was a handwritten note in his distinctive script, the careful lettering of someone who wanted his final words to be legible. To whoever finds this, I'm a coward who couldn't face legal consequences, and an even bigger coward who couldn't face what I'd become. Sarah Holland is being held at 1847 Pratt Street, basement level. The combination is 082419, our mother's birthday. She's innocent of everything except the crime of being beautiful enough to trigger something broken in me. Make sure she's freed. Make sure she knows I'm sorry. Make sure my family never knows the full extent of what I did because Mom doesn't deserve to die knowing she raised a monster. I'm ending this the only way I know how, taking the sickness with me where it can't hurt anyone else. I chose the cold because it seemed cleaner than a bullet, more like going to sleep than committing violence even against myself. I deserve worse than this. Sarah deserved better than me. God forgive me, because I can't forgive myself. The date on the note was 8 months ago, within days of when Marco had vanished from everyone's life, and when the electrical anomaly at the building had started showing up on utility bills. He'd locked himself in this freezer and let the cold take him rather than face exposure, choosing death over accountability, suicide over the hard work of actually making amends or facing justice for his crimes. Sarah made a sound, something between a sob and a laugh, that broken noise survivors made when reality exceeded their capacity to process it in normal emotional terms. He left me there to die, wrote a confession that would have freed me if anyone had found it, then killed himself without telling anyone where to look. He kept apologizing for what he did, but did nothing to fix it, nothing to actually help me. It was all performance, all guilt that served himself, rather than action that served me. Dante stared at his brother's preserved body, this man he'd shared a childhood with, whose secrets he'd thought he knew, and whose darkness he'd never suspected ran this deep beneath the surface of their relationship. The note claimed Marco couldn't face legal consequences, but that was only half-truth. He also couldn't face the family learning what he'd become, couldn't endure the shame of recognition from the people whose opinion he valued. So he'd chosen the coward's exit suicide dressed as sacrifice, death framed as atonement when it was really just escape from consequences. "Boss," Vincent said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of implications he didn't want to speak aloud but couldn't avoid. "We need to make decisions. How do we handle this? If we report it, every detail becomes public. If we don't, we're covering up kidnapping and leaving questions unanswered that could come back to destroy us later." The question hung in the cold air, waiting for Dante to choose between family loyalty and moral truth, between protecting the organization and serving justice, between the man he'd been raised to be and the man he was trying to become. He could make all of this disappear. His organization had the resources and expertise. The Rivero name would remain unsullied by the scandal of Marco's crimes. Or he could call the police, turn over the confession, let the world know what his brother had done. He looked at Sarah, at this woman who'd survived through sheer will. She met his eyes, and he saw her weighing possibilities too, wondering whether a mafia don's promise meant anything against generations of family loyalty. "What do you want?" he asked her, and meant it completely. "This is your choice. Whatever you decide, I'll make it happen." Sarah walked to the freezer, her damaged feet leaving small blood spots on the concrete as bandages soaked through. She stared at Marco's body for a long moment. "I want people to know," she said finally, her voice carrying strength that defied everything she'd endured. "Not all the details. Not the confession, those are mine to decide whether to share. But I want people to know that Marco Rivero was a criminal who held a woman prisoner, and that he chose death over accountability. I want his name associated with what he did, not erased because it's inconvenient, for your family's reputation." The request was reasonable and impossible in equal measure. What Sarah wanted would invite scrutiny his organization couldn't withstand. But as he looked at his brother's frozen form, at the walls covered in Marco's attempts to understand his own sickness, Dante felt something crack in the foundation of his loyalty. "Vincent," he said quietly, "call Attorney Wallace. Tell him we're bringing him evidence of a crime. Marco Rivero kidnapped and imprisoned Sarah Hallen. The full confession is available. We're cooperating completely." Vincent's face went blank. "Boss, if we do this—" "I know what it could do," Dante interrupted. "Do it anyway." Sarah turned to him, surprise on her features. "Why?" "Because someone has to break the pattern," Dante said. "Someone has to choose truth over protection. Marco couldn't do it, but I can." He pulled out his phone and dialed the attorney, listening to it ring, which, in a very real sense, he had. The attorney answered on the fourth ring, sleep-rough voice demanding to know who was calling at 4 a.m. Dante identified himself, heard the sharp intake of breath that meant recognition, that meant understanding this call would be the most important and dangerous of the lawyer's career. "I need you to arrange a meeting with the FBI," Dante said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to set in motion. "Today, and I need you to start drafting immunity agreements. Because I'm about to hand you evidence that will put me and my entire organization under federal investigation." Sarah watched him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, that would be too simple. Something more complex. An acknowledgement that justice didn't erase trauma, that legal consequences didn't undo 8 months of hell, but that witness and accountability mattered even when they couldn't repair what had been broken. "Thank you," she said finally. Dante nodded, already planning the conversations he'd need to have with his family, the assets he'd need to protect, and the legitimate businesses he'd need to separate from criminal operations before federal investigators descended like a storm that would leave nothing standing in its wake. The FBI field office in Baltimore occupied a brutalist concrete structure that looked designed to intimidate. Dante had never entered through the front doors voluntarily, had spent his entire adult life avoiding contact with federal law enforcement. Attorney Wallace sat beside him in the secure conference room 12 hours later. A man whose 60 years showed in the deep lines around his eyes, but whose mind remained sharp as surgical steel. "You control the narrative until you sign immunity agreements," Wallace said quietly while they waited. "Once you sign, you're committed to complete truth regardless of consequences." Sarah sat across the hall in a separate interview room, giving her statement to agents who specialized in kidnapping cases. She'd insisted on doing this alone, had said she needed to tell her story without his presence shaping the narrative or creating subconscious pressure to minimize trauma for his benefit. The door opened. 3 federal agents entered with a prosecutor whose reputation preceded her. Assistant U.S. Attorney Carmen Reeves had built her career taking down organized crime families, had put away 5 bosses in her 15 years with the DOJ. She regarded Dante with the cold assessment of someone evaluating a dangerous animal that claimed to want domestication but might still bite. "Mr. Rivero," she said, taking the chair opposite him with deliberate precision, "your attorney says you want to make a statement regarding your brother's crimes and offer cooperation regarding your organization's activities. That's quite an unexpected development given your family's history of silence." "My brother kidnapped and imprisoned an innocent woman for 8 months," Dante said, keeping his voice level and professional. "He documented his crimes in extensive detail before killing himself. I discovered both his victim and his confession. I want to ensure justice for her, which means I need immunity before I can discuss how his crimes intersect with my family's business operations." Reeves exchanged glances with her agents, silent communication that spoke of skepticism and opportunity in equal measure. "You understand that cooperation means complete disclosure? Every crime, every operation, every family member involved. We're not interested in partial truth or strategic omissions that protect the people you care about." "I understand," Dante said, and felt the weight of those words settle over him like a sentence he was imposing on himself. "I'm prepared to dismantle my entire organization if that's what justice requires. But I need guarantees for the people who were following orders rather than giving them. My father's generation made choices that my generation inherited. I won't protect the architects, but I won't sacrifice the foot soldiers either." The negotiation lasted 6 hours, Wallace earning his substantial fee by carving out protections for Dante's lower-level employees while exposing the core criminal operations. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony, witness protection if threats emerged, financial security for his mother, and legitimate business interests that could be separated from criminal enterprise. Every clause was a concession, every paragraph a piece of the empire he was voluntarily destroying. By the time they emerged, dusk had painted the city in shades of amber and shadow. Dante's phone showed 47 missed calls from family members, associates, and business partners who'd heard rumors of his FBI visit and were making their own calculations about loyalty versus self-preservation. The walls were closing in, his organization fracturing as people chose sides or chose flight. Sarah waited in the building's lobby, her statement completed, her role in the federal case established and documented. She looked exhausted in ways that transcended physical tiredness, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd survived hell, only to discover that escape meant endless recounting of trauma for people who needed every detail documented and verified. "How did it go?" he asked, a question that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd endured, what she'd just relived in clinical detail for federal agents taking notes. "They're professional, thorough. They believe me. which shouldn't feel like an accomplishment, but does after months of wondering if anyone would ever know what happened to me. She stood with visible effort, her bandaged feet a constant reminder of captivity's physical cost. What happens now? Now I tear down everything my family built, Dante said simply, the words carrying a finality that felt both liberating and terrifying. The FBI has enough evidence to prosecute a dozen major cases: money laundering, racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling operations. Some of it goes back to my grandfather's time. All of it ends with me. They walked out into the Baltimore evening, the city stretching around them with its usual indifferent beauty. Traffic hummed past on Pratt Street. Office workers hurried toward parking garages, eager to begin weekends that promised escape from routine. Normal life continuing while Dante's world underwent tectonic shift, while everything he'd known dissolved into federal evidence and testimony that would echo through courtrooms for years. I need to disappear for a while, Sarah said abruptly, stopping on the sidewalk outside the federal building. The media attention when this breaks Marco's crimes, your testimony, the trial. I can't be here for that. Can't watch it play out on every news channel while reporters camp outside wherever I'm living, turning my trauma into entertainment. The request was reasonable, expected even, but Dante felt something shift in his chest at the thought of her leaving. This woman who'd briefly been the center of his world's transformation, who'd catalyzed everything that was about to happen. Where will you go? I have an aunt in Santa Fe. Haven't seen her in years, but she's offered to let me stay as long as I need. Space to heal away from all of this. Sarah studied his face, reading something he hadn't realized he was showing. You could visit, once things settle, if you wanted. If you're not in prison, or witness protection, or wherever this takes you. The offer hung between them, fragile and complicated, pregnant with possibilities neither could fully articulate. They'd been thrown together by tragedy, connected through Marco's crimes in ways that made simple friendship impossible and anything more ethically fraught. But something existed in the space between those complications, a recognition that survival created bonds that didn't fit conventional categories. I'd like that, Dante said carefully. When things settle, if they ever do. He arranged for a car to take her to Union Station, where she'd catch the Capital Limited to Chicago, then transfer to the Southwest Chief. The long way to New Mexico, but she'd said she needed time to watch the country pass, to remember that the world was larger than the room where she'd been imprisoned. Before she left, she turned back, her hand on the car door. What you're doing, destroying your family's empire to give me justice, it doesn't erase what happened, doesn't heal the damage. You know that, right? I know, Dante said, but it changes the pattern, and sometimes that's all you can do. Sometimes breaking the cycle is enough, even when it can't repair what's already broken. She nodded and climbed into the car, and he watched the taillights disappear into traffic, carrying away the woman whose suffering had catalyzed everything, whose survival had given him permission to become someone different than what he'd been raised to be. 3 months later, the Southwest Chief pulled into Albuquerque Station 6 hours behind schedule, mechanical issues in Kansas, having turned a tight connection into an exercise in patience that Dante had learned to cultivate during endless hours of testimony and depositions. The trial had ended 3 days ago with guilty verdicts on 17 counts, sentences totaling 847 years distributed across 12 defendants. His testimony had been the prosecution's cornerstone, each session dismantling another piece of his family's empire with surgical precision. The media had called him everything from hero to traitor, depending on which outlet was reporting and what narrative they wanted to construct. His mother still refused his calls, her silence more damning than any accusation. His father's former associates had put a price on his head that made witness protection seem less like paranoia and more like practical necessity for survival. The drive to Santa Fe took him through high desert landscape that looked alien compared to Baltimore's humidity and coastal proximity. Vast sky pressing down on ancient mesas, geology measured in epochs rather than years. His GPS directed him to an adobe house on the city's east side, where pinyon trees provided sparse shade and prayer flags fluttered in the constant wind. Sarah answered the door before he finished climbing the porch steps, as if she'd been watching for his arrival. 3 months had changed her in ways that transcended physical healing. Her feet had healed, though she said she still felt phantom pain where the shackles had cut deepest. Her hair was shorter, styled in a way that suggested choice rather than necessity. But the most significant change was in her eyes. They held careful assessment of trust earned rather than assumed, the measured caution of someone who'd learned that safety was built slowly through consistent action rather than promised in words. "You look different," she said by way of greeting. "Less heavy. Like you've been carrying something for years and finally set it down." They sat on her aunt's patio while afternoon thunderheads built over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, nature staging its daily performance of threat and promise. Sarah's Aunt Teresa brought iced tea and then tactfully disappeared into the house, giving them privacy that felt both generous and slightly uncomfortable. "The trial's over," Dante said, starting with facts because facts felt safer than feelings. 12 convictions, the organizations effectively dismantled, federal oversight for the legitimate businesses that survive. "My family name is synonymous with corruption in 4 states. I watched some of it," Sarah admitted. "Testified via video link so I wouldn't have to see them in person. Your Uncle Victor tried to have me declared an unreliable witness, said I was mentally unstable from trauma." Dante's jaw tightened. "Did the jury?" "They saw through it." Reeves destroyed him on cross-examination. She sipped her tea. "Your testimony helped. They couldn't dismiss both of us as unreliable." Rain began falling, creating impact craters in the dusty courtyard. They moved under the patio cover, watching precipitation that might last 5 minutes or 5 hours. "I started therapy," Sarah said. "Dr. Matsuda specializes in captivity trauma. She says recovery isn't linear. Some days I feel normal. Some days I wake up convinced I'm still in that room. Do the good days outnumber the bad ones? Not yet, but the ratio's improving." She watched rain create temporary rivers. She asked about you, whether I felt safe around you, whether your presence triggered association with Marco. "What did you tell her?" Sarah smiled, melancholy but real. "That I'm attracted to you and terrified by that attraction. That I can't tell if what I feel is genuine or trauma bonding. That the ethics of a relationship between us are murky at best." "What did she say?" "That I should trust my instincts but proceed slowly. That I get to decide what healing looks like." Sarah turned to face him directly. "So I'm deciding. I want you in my life, Dante. Not as savior or project. As someone who understands survival, who knows what it costs to break family patterns." "I want that too," Dante said carefully. "But I'm not expecting anything. No pressure, no obligation." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why I'm saying yes to more." They sat in companionable quiet while rain continued. More time together. More conversations. More discovering whether connection forged in crisis could survive normal life. After dinner with Teresa, they debated whether he should stay in the guest room. Eventually, Teresa won with pragmatic argument about the long drive. He drafted a text to Sarah, "Thank you for letting me visit. Sleep well." Her response came quickly. "You're allowed to just exist here. No scorecard, just presence. Good night." Morning arrived with high desert clarity. They ate breakfast together, huevos, rancheros, and fresh tortillas. "Are you staying another day?" Sarah asked directly. "If you want me to." "I want you to." So he stayed. And the next day, and the following week, he found a rental house, started photography classes, volunteered at a legal aid clinic, and he spent time with Sarah, slowly building something that wasn't defined by trauma. 6 months later, Sarah came with news of a Seattle gallery job. "I'm taking it," she said. "I need to prove I can build a life independent of rescue and recovery." "Come with me," she added, just as someone also starting over. "I could arrange relocation," Dante said. "Then arrange it." 2 years later, Pike Place Market hosted Dante's photography exhibition, illumination portraits of people who'd left criminal organizations to build new lives. Carmen Reeves attended, the prosecutor now an unlikely friend. "You've come a long way," she observed. "That man still exists," Dante said honestly. "Just makes different choices now. Every day. That's all any of us can do," Reeves said. "Choose better. The aggregate becomes character." Sarah moved through the crowd as senior curator, her exhibition series on survival drawing international attention. She and Dante maintained separate apartments but spent most nights together relationship, built on mutual respect and careful trust. They'd learned healing wasn't linear, that some days were harder, but surviving together created different strength than surviving alone. Teresa visited from Santa Fe with green chile and love. Rosa came from Pittsburgh with her children next generation raised without criminal empire's weight. Dr. Okafor sent cards from Baltimore. The community was small but genuine survivors who understood each other's scars, people who'd chosen difficulty over comfort. As evening settled, Dante found Sarah on the balcony watching ferries cross Elliott Bay. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," Sarah said. "Present. Here. Free." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Two people who'd found each other in a locked room and learned that survival meant helping each other remember how to live. They walked into Seattle Rain together. Two survivors who'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past but refusing to let it write the future. That transformation happened in small daily choices. Behind them, the gallery glowed rooms of suffering transformed into art, testifying to resilience's quiet power. The pattern was broken. Finally, completely, necessarily. And in its place, something new grew fragile and imperfect and entirely their own. The city spread before them, lights flickering on as darkness gathered countless rooms where countless stories unfolded, all of them human in their messy, complicated, ongoing refusal to let history have the final word.